Hello, everyone. Welcome to 10 Things That Scare Me live. Lucky we're starting a little late because you missed all the cacophonous cheering for 7 o'clock and dogs barking and everything. So here we are. We're getting started a little bit late, but I hope we're all together. You guys, if you know 10 Things That Scare Me, you know that it's actually just like usually a really weird short podcast. But for tonight and tonight only, we're going to be a weird short kind of TV show, whatever TV is, live stream thing. And it's going to be just me, you guys, and all the way from Tallahassee, Florida, author and yard rewilder, Jeff VanderMeer. Jeff is the author of numerous novels. I'm going to talk about some of the ones I've read. The Southern Reach trilogy, which I would describe as an outside space and time, multidimensional corporate procedural and bioecological love story. And also Borne, one of my faves, which I would call a post-apocalyptic non-human coming of age tale and love story. And his most recent novel, Dead Astronauts, a perspective-shifting, boundary-busting love story about resistance, cruelty, and hope. There's a lot of love in his books, a lot of weirdness. Jeff did an episode of 10 Things That Scare Me. His original episode was a staff favorite. We love how he thinks, and his list was really thoughtful and also vulnerable, if you heard it. I think one of my favorite things about it was because Jeff is so in love with the nature in his yard. We sent him a recorder, and he was kind enough to go out and collect birdsong and other weird sounds from his backyard, like himself weed whacking. And our sound designer, Isaac Jones, used that in the scoring of his episode. We're going to play a clip right here.
Number 1, climate change. Number 2, the old house. You know that there's a gray fox that hangs out at night there. You know the possum, you know the raccoon, you know the birds. I've been worrying about what will happen to the creatures in the yard if I have to sell. And can I have a contract with a buyer which basically says you can't change anything in the yard, which I don't think is something you can do. Number 3, the new house. In buying a new house, we're essentially saying we believe in the future of Florida in a climate change scenario. I just was at the new place and using the broom that I found there, and the cap on the end of the stick of the broom, which happened to be hollow, was off, and inside was a whole family of tree frogs.
All right. Welcome, Jeff. I have recited that little poem from that clip so many times where you say the cap on the end of the stick of the broom. I love it. Our whole team used to say to each other, welcome to my house. Welcome to your house. Whatever.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm really excited. We're going to get to your new list of 10 fears pretty soon, but I wanted to start off. Actually, let me add that if anybody out there has a question, you could use your little chatty thing on FaceTime or whatever to chat a question. And if we have time at the end, we'll get to them, okay? But before we get to your new list, can we talk about some of the worlds you create? Jeff? Jeff?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I haven't read all your books, but I've read quite a few of them. And I think of the places you create as like, they're kind of ruined, some of them to different degrees, but nature persists and beauty persists. What what makes you create these places that are kind of wrecked but still changing and living?
I don't know. I had an awareness of climate change as early as the 80s. So most of my work has these recurring things, but then also the real world around us has a lot of ruined places where nature is still trying to find a way. And I guess I put these things in juxtaposition because I feel that's where the tension in our future lives is going to be. And if we don't resolve that, and if we don't reach an accommodation with the natural world and realize it's not separate from us, we're going to be in real trouble. Not just the trouble we're in now, but the real trouble.
Yeah. One of the places that really stuck with me are the scenes from one of the Southern Reach trilogy books is when they're at like trying to enter back into the borderlands and they're in the cold ocean, like out on the reefs, and Control or whatever that poor guy's name is in real life, like slips and kind of like is cutting himself on the coral and the water's freezing. And I think about that place a lot. And is that like cold seashore a place that you really have been to?
Yeah, actually, the cutting and that kind of tactile aspect was actually from putting a nail through my foot in Fiji. And then the cold seashore is actually Vancouver Island, a very remote part of it, called, I believe, Rock Bay, something like that. But it's maybe a 2-hour hair-raising drive from Victoria, and it's this very desolate but very beautiful place. And the thing about my books is that there's that people always remark on the speculative element or the weird element, but they're very much based on, trying to be a close observer of the real world that we live in, and that's where those kinds of details come from.
Another place that's always stuck with me is, obviously the swimming pool that's been kind of taken over by nature that the biologist is very into as a kid, and also the empty lot that she comes back into, which kind of reminds me of your whole project of rewilding your yard.
Well, you could say the swimming pool is like the precursor to it, because growing up in Gainesville, Florida, we rented a house that had an overgrown swimming pool. And that was the first time I really thought about becoming a biologist in real terms, not just when I was in Fiji and like tidal pools. And so, that really resonated with me. And when in 2016, after the elections, is when I really began to get really serious about the rewilding. And then we moved to this new place on this little hidden ravine, only 10 minutes from the heart of Tallahassee. And, I started working on the yard, and I didn't realize that it was full of invasive species, that it was basically a food desert for wildlife and birds. I just saw this amazing jungle. So I had to take a crash course on native plants and what that means for biodiversity and everything else. And I became very obsessed. I'm very obsessive on the subjects that I choose to pursue. And so I wound up digging out something like 4,000 air potatoes and the tubers, and another 1,000 coral ardesia, which is another terrible, horrible thing. And then we planted, I think, maybe 400 native plants. That's wildflowers, understory trees, and bushes. And it's been an amazing transformation. And I don't know how to describe it. It's a strange thing of being in quarantine and being surrounded by all this beauty and knowing that you're very privileged to have it. But it's also really quite a responsibility that I think about, that I wake up thinking about every day.
Yeah, I think in the old list, that in the original episode, I think it was right about the time that you were moving or closing on the new house. And one of the things that just made my heart leap was that you were kind of musing about, is it possible to put a rider on the sale that says you can't wreck the yard or like get rid of the animals? And it's just
so the old place we still held on to because we haven't figured out how to do that. So I go over there and it's like going to this ghost, but it's still this very dear old friend as well. So
I just love that so much, that you held on to the old house because you know the fox, you know I can't remember the list of animals that you gave, like the different kind of birds, and you don't want to destroy their home.
Yeah, it's just tough because animals and trees don't really have enough protections. It seems like it should be a no-brainer at this point, but yeah. So I go back and forth between these two worlds now, these two different types of yards, and I don't know. Every time I go back to the old place, it's with new eyes. So now I go back to the old place, and I'm like, why did I let this tree grow? And I need to put this thing in. So I'm very grateful that even though it took so long, that I'm actually finally feel like I'm learning something about the world that I'm moving through.
That's such a great feeling. I actually get that feeling a little bit reading your books and how full of animals they are. And I feel like there's always I don't know if it's the author's attempt or like the character's attempt or just the overall experience of the book's attempt to make me have an experience of what it's like to be a non-human and be in the world as a non-human, which maybe is just because I'm obsessed with that idea. But I feel like I would love to know your first memory of an animal and your feelings about like animals' consciousness.
Well, Fiji was vastly influential, and the
You grew up in Fiji, right?
I grew up in Fiji. My parents were in the Peace Corps, and my dad studied invasive species like the rhinoceros beetle. So we would go to these remote islands, and he would do his studies, and we would also, kind of walk on the parts of the reef that you could walk on, and so a lot of it was sea life. A lot of it was, these amazing starfish, these bioluminescent creatures, and I just remember actually two very vivid memories, but they're fairly negative. But they made me kind of question the way things are. And one was seeing a parrotfish on the end of someone's spear gun, and just being kind of aghast that something so beautiful was being treated that way. And I know people have to fish for food. But as a kid, that was my first reaction, to see something so beautiful just discarded in a way, or not thought of as being important beyond food. I'm trying to think of other things. It's such a combination of experiences. Like on the way back, we stopped in Jaipur and some other places, and so I remember very vividly also the lurch of an elephant getting to its feet that we were being carried on, but then also the kind of weariness of it at the same time. So it's like these little moments that are bound together by being an appreciation for animals, but also the beginning of a questioning of how we treat animals. And then also the natural world there. You'd have all kinds of amazing, brilliantly colored birds in Fiji, and amazing kingfishers. And one of my first writing experiences was keeping a birding journal, and then basically writing short stories about birds because I got bored with the birding journal. And so that's kind of where I guess it started. But then it's also difficult when you're kind of immersed in it to kind of recognize where it starts, because as far as I'm concerned, it's always kind of been there. So
I see. It reminds me of in Dead Astronauts, your latest book, right? It's your latest book, right?
Yeah.
You didn't sneak another one out while I was.
No, I keep trying. I mean, Dead Astronauts is one that snuck out. So yeah, it's the new one.
It snuck out right at the beginning of the coronavirus, or just like a couple months before, right? Yeah. But there's a lot of repetition in there, which is one of my favorite things, as anybody who's worked on a team with me knows. So I'm always like, let's put it in 25 times. Let's do it the same over and over. And I really appreciate how that like helps you change your understanding of something if you actually in real time like repeat it to yourself. But one of the things that, and I'm not going to get it right probably, but that this character of the fox says is that to live without interference is one of the things, and without unnatural threat, and without persecution. Are those the three things?
Those are three of the things, yeah. And I think the repetition. I even changed the reference points when I read. Like, there's the part that's about live without so on and so forth. And when I first read because I do read the repetitiveness of it sometimes, I do the first part of the sentence with that emphasis, and then the second time around, the emphasis on the object of the sentence. And then I think people really get why. And then when you get to the end of those repetitions, I do see a genuine emotion in the reader who has to experience it live. I think it may be different experiencing it on the page sometimes. But I really truly believe in using all kinds of different techniques to try to get people past the assumptions we do make about non-human life and the assumptions that we make even maybe about narrative. You know, it's hard to write about climate crisis and not also want to break out of the normal narrative patterns that you sometimes worry are actually part of propping up the old ideas, you know? So.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this isn't something I should say, but whatever. It's just a Zoom.
It's just a Zoom. It's just us.
It's just a Zoom.
One's listening.
But like sometimes I'm like proselytizing the books, and I'm like, just read it. And I worry that the person is going to be like stopped or turned off by some of the wackiness. But I actually don't think that's happened yet. I think everyone that I've recommended the books to has loved it. And I don't know why I think that, well, I understand it and love it, but they won't. It's amazing the appetite for things that while I'm reading it seem so out there, but the books are so, yeah, go ahead. Talk to me about that.
Oh, I was going to say, I try very hard to be immersive. I try very hard to be tactile, and I try very hard for there to be an emotional core. And what I found is Dead Astronauts, maybe the purest expression of that is if you adhere to those things, you can go very strange but useful places that you might not get to otherwise and still have the reader come along. But then at the same time, it's worth noting that, you know, any non-realist fiction, when you summarize it to someone, what the plot is, generally sounds like, I don't know. So, you know, you always kind of have that to deal with, I suppose. But no, I've been very happy with the fact that people have followed me to these places, and they've really loved these characters. And they've even followed me through Dead Astronauts with this kind of unconventional narrative, and they've understood, you know, what I'm trying to do, and that means a lot to me.
That's great. We are going to get to your fears. I just want to ask, quote unquote, say that I love Balcony Cliffs. The Balcony Cliffs is the name of it. Is the best, and it's like hilariously funny to me, but it's also it's like such a horrible place but such a great hideaway. And it's Balcony Cliffs is like a place where some of your characters live, and it's like a ruined high-rise condo Florida type. Maybe it's not Florida. I just say that because my grandparents lived
Good
in Florida
question.
and they lived in something that's like
Yeah.
Stratford Arms or something. They like name their condos such weird stuff. But where did you come up with that name? And do you want to live there too? Or is it just me?
One thing I really loved about Edward Carey's Observation Mansions, I think it's called, sorry, I probably got that wrong, but is that he used this setting of this one building in such a creative and innovative way. And there's a French writer who did the same thing, where like every scene is in a different room of this French apartment house. And I thought about that. And I think probably the observatory mansions kind of stuck in my head. So balcony cliffs kind of, it's like a little bit of an ode to that, even though there's no connection. But then it had to very much be its own character. I do believe what Vladimir Nabokov taught, which was, if there's not clarity in the settings that you're using, then there's not clarity in the narrative. So having the balcony cliffs kind of spelled out at the beginning of Borne and having it tied to how the main character feels about her relationship with this other person, Wick, does two things. First of all, it acts as characterization, but it also gives you this blueprint for a place you're going to be spending a lot of time in. And if that's clear, then the novel will be clear. And if that's not clear, the novel will be muddy and you won't get to the emotional places I want you to get to. And it sounds like a craft issue, and it is, but so many times the art of something is so dependent on whether you got that craft thing correct, because you can't do the other things without it. So I'm glad you noticed that. It was definitely something that I had to put a lot of thought into. And then it reappears in Dead Astronauts in a way I thought was kind of interesting as well. So.
Yeah. I love the name of it, and I've often told myself at times, like, I'm just going to go to the balcony cliffs and just get rid of all this crap. But it hasn't happened yet. All right. I know it's not, I guess if anybody's read the books, I guess it might not seem appealing because it's kind of like mold infested, and then there's like everything is wrecked and it's booby trapped, but there's old books in it and there's like a lot of food like hidden around, and I like booby traps. I think they're fun as long as you don't get stuck in them. But let's go to your fears. I was going to ask you about the coronavirus, but we could talk about that next year. Why don't we play your most recent fears?
My name is Jeff VanderMeer, and these are 10 things that scare me. 1, hell is indeed other people. I feel like I can't trust other people anymore to keep their distance or to keep safety precautions. We even went hiking to a place with only 2 cars in the parking lot and had to swerve way off the path to avoid people who apparently thought they were on vacation, which is very startling to be out in a wild space and realize that there's this thing you have to deal with. And then you begin to feel like you are getting the same experience that animals have dealing with humans. 2, instinctual politeness. I can't even always trust myself when I'm gardening in the front yard. A city worker might come to mark utility lines and I strike up a conversation, and afterwards I don't remember whether I was actually 6 feet away. And I see people in the neighborhood sitting next to each other in chairs and it makes me recoil. But again, I'm not always aware of my own spatial coordinates in relationship to other people. 3, contamination from other sources. So we're heading into our second summer of the rewilding and native plants project at the new place, and it's going to be a rigorous test. We've cleared all these invasives like air potato from large portions of the yard, but it's still festering there, and if you're not vigilant, basically it'll all come back and ruin the stuff that you've done already and all the native plants that you've planted. So in the midst of the stress of everything else, even though it's an immense privilege to be able to be outside every day and working in the yard, I also have to maintain this discipline to protect our plantings and not just do what I want to do, which is curl up in a ball and go into hibernation until most of this is over. 4, and I think this is related to the first 3, loss of perspective. I think with the added pandemic stress weighing down, I can lose a lot of perspective. So every sound that I can't identify from neighboring properties is not someone cutting down trees or doing something destructive in the little ravine that's behind our house. But I find myself reacting that way and immediately thinking it's the worst case scenario. And so I have this image in my head that helps me focus about that, which is that I don't want to appear to the neighbors or others to be that kind of crotchety curmudgeon who appears out of the ravine just to lecture them about native plants or why they shouldn't cut down a pine tree and then just disappears back into the ravine. I feel like that's not really a good look for me. 5, squandering the moment. I just have this general fear that coronavirus will become delinked from its context embedded in climate crisis. And in this post-factual world, will be politicized to the point that we won't, at least in the US, take it as a wake-up call about the environment. And I would say this is kind of a festering long-term fear that the coronavirus has just kind of crystallized and made visible to me. 6, monarch caterpillars. Yes, that is correct. Monarch caterpillars. I fear them for how they manipulate me. So they eat our milkweed down to shreds, and then I panic buy more milkweed to plant so they have something to eat. But the fact is that as with many caterpillars, their survival rate is middling at best. So I fear things happening to them, and lo and behold, things happen to them because that's the way the world works. So I'm not sure if I actually fear them or if I just, in some ways, oddly and perversely resent them. 7, the rabbit. So yes, I fear the rabbit, not the old rabbit who is very wary and lives under the dead oak tree in our yard. No, I fear the new rabbit who is fearless of me, and thus the other day ate this rare Coreopsis wildflower right in front of me that only grows a few places in North Florida. And I chased him away, but he came back to eat the rest later, and I had to just basically sit there in kind of simmering rage and calm down because the whole point of the yard is for wildlife. But I also fear for the rabbit because this particular one is so oblivious to threat and always seems like it feels like it's camouflaged when it's not. 8, boredom. I fear first the general boredom of people in lockdown. I find it, first of all, kind of sad and telling because it's a luxury for us to be bored given all the terrible things going on in the world. But in a specific rewilding native plants context, I fear the boredom of strangers local to me in how folks are doing all kinds of things in their yards, in part because they've run out of other things to do. So, as I walk around various neighborhoods, when there's an opportunity to do so in a way where no one else is around, I see a lot of experiments that are actually detrimental to birds and wildlife and insects. And I have to kind of tamp down this fear because it's not under my control. And also, it's about people who have good intentions. But just like myself, 2 years ago, I didn't know anything about native plants. And I might have been doing some of those same experiments. 9, this is very specific, LED lights. Our city has slowly replaced street lamps with LEDs. And unfortunately, as with a lot of green technology, there's things that go unexamined with that. So LEDs are much brighter and the white light is much more attractive to insects. So as they replace these street lamps, I fear that we're going to lose more fireflies and other beneficial insects. So this easily could have been fixed by our city, Tallahassee, and others doing more research and understanding that just because something is energy saving doesn't mean that it's completely beneficial. But in fact, we seem now intent on this light pollution that does harm to our world, and also some studies show does harm to us. 10. The hair on my head. With no haircut in sight, and my wife Anne unwilling to cut my hair due to the possibility of resulting marital discord, I feel more and more oppressed by the beast that weighs down on my head and seems at times to move without warning and to no longer have much to do with me. And there are times when I'm working in the yard and I think something's stalking me, but it's just the side of my hair on my head.
All right, hair. Yeah, I've been, so worried about my hair because my hair is really thick and it was getting so intense and so hot and like just going everywhere. So yesterday I actually did Corona self haircut, and
Oh wow.
I don't know if you can. I started off on my own, but it was soon not working. So I got my neighbor and her husband's beard trimmer, and except for a few holes, I think it turned out pretty well. What do you think of it, Jeff?
It looks fine to me. It looks good. I'm trying to just trim a little bit because it was just ridiculous. So I'm a little better than I was, but it's beginning to weigh on me. But I just can't imagine why won't get hurt.
I know. I don't even know if you could hear. I was going to ask why won't Anne cut your hair?
She's afraid she'll do a terrible job and then that I will resent her for it. I'm like, it's a mercy killing of hair, really. It doesn't matter how it turns out. Just please, God, relieve me of this burden. She finally said that she would.
You should see, I have a big bald spot right here, but it'll cover in. Whatever, don't look.
Yeah. Well, it's beginning to remind me of when I used to dye my hair when my students if they turned their story in on time at this teen writing camp, I would dye my hair. And one year I decided to use the stuff you just spray on as temporary, and it formed a helmet. And it was like stuck to my head. Like it was just so, that I felt like my brain was being constricted by my hair. And I'm beginning to feel that way with this, which is, there's not much here, but it just, it's just too much. And it's a minor complaint, obviously, in the grand scheme of things. But still, it's, I don't like being frightened by my hair. So.
Well, I want to get to a couple of comments, but let me ask you about a couple of your fears besides your hair.
Okay.
One of your fears, squandering the moment, I think it was number 5. Can you tell us about your ideas, just like coronavirus as part of the climate crisis?
Well, I think that kind of codifying things that we're doing or not doing now because of the virus as a way of mitigating our footprint with regard to the climate crisis. Even the simplest things of turning urban areas into foot traffic only and limiting traffic and seeing that it's so important to transition over into other kinds of fuel. To re-examine maybe even like the simplest little things that we do on a daily basis. Even just the things that we hoard that are now that are causing all kinds of other problems, or the fact that on the one hand we're liquidating all this poultry and because we have these ridiculous supply chains. So I think it's laying bare is the waste in the world, for one thing. And I just hope that in general people internalize the feeling that things are not right, and understand that they have to keep feeling that way even after this is over, because this is part of the climate crisis. And if we delink it somehow, we just go back to normal afterwards. And I'm hesitant to give what I think should be policy points, because I'm not a scientist or a politician or an analyst. But it just seems to me that this is a moment to make a break with some of the things that are destructive, and to realize we really are in the middle of climate crisis right now, we have to find ways to mitigate that. But also, I would just say that, not to go on too long, but I have been really amazed by the sense of community here in Tallahassee and the way people have banded together. And all we hear on the news is about the people who are rejecting the reality of the situation. And all I see here, and I'm sure in a lot of communities, is people, who may be of differing political persuasions across a certain spectrum, but they understand the reality of this. They understand about the importance of community and helping each other. So
I was going to ask about that, the hell is other people fear, where you're worried, you find yourself worrying that people won't keep 6 feet of distance. But is that a problem where you live?
It is still a problem. Anne and I divide up different tasks different ways, and one thing she does is she goes to the grocery stores, and there have been a couple of times when there are clearly people who are flaunting their disregard for the rules, and that's something that can be very deeply unsettling. I think in part because obviously of the personal risk, but then this idea that society is fraying at the edges in a way that's not normal, that's not, that we I don't know. It becomes very on a deeply subconscious level very frightening, and
I think society. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I think it's maybe because you realize even more viscerally that there's different versions of reality that people are moving through. If that makes any sense, and that maybe those realities don't touch at all anymore. So. Yeah,
I've just from my experience with the 127 episodes of 10 Things That Scare Me, society breaking down is at the base of a lot of people's fears, and people being afraid of a pandemic was mainly not so much afraid of dying or losing people, but afraid of society breaking down because of a pandemic. So
yeah, and we always think that it's not going to happen here, but it can easily happen anywhere, depending on what the circumstances are, which is why the community stuff is so important.
Well, let me ask you then, it's not part of your fears, although it does kind of underline a lot of them. Because besides writing your novels, you also, are on the judging team. That's not sorry. For some awards. That's not a judging team. It's okay, folks.
Felt like a judging team. National Book Award, yeah.
Yeah.
It was a very judgy team.
Is it a team? It's a judgy team. You're on the judgy team for the National Book Award. And you also have put together a lot of anthologies. So you definitely have read a lot of past, present science fiction. And I wonder, as in that world of people kind of highlighting ways that the society works or doesn't work through future versions of it, or alternate past versions of it, do you have a way of looking at the coronavirus and its effect on the world and what that science fiction book would be like?
Well, I think that actually speaks to a problem with reacting too quickly as a writer, which is to say that I tend to deeply internalize things and they come out years later. I'm very mistrustful of the present impulse in myself even to write something relevant to it or that speaks to it. And that's just because of the kind of writer I am. There are writers who I think could probably speak to it and are speaking to it right now. But for me, it's always got to come out somewhat differently than the reality of it. And it has to live in this visceral space. And I often think it's very similar to having to get distance from personal events like autobiographical events before you can write them into fiction. It's just on a different scale. And so really, it's going to take a while probably to do that, even as I'm working on a near future thriller that's going to have to probably grapple with it in some guise. Interesting.
Can I share with you some of the comments that we've gotten?
Sure. Positive, negative, bizarre.
They're all super negative. No, yay, I see a positive one. I see a positive one. I'm just kidding. One of them is, please produce Neo.
Oh,
but it's too late for that.
To do that? I can do that. Is it okay?
Yeah, run away, Jeff. Yes, I will entertain the crowd while you're gone. Guys, did you know that some people actually have 3 nostrils? We'll talk about that later. Here he is.
This is basically the inspiration for Mord and Chori in the Southern Reach and a wide variety. He's basically a bear cat. He does not like being held, so he is going to leave us now.
Goodbye, Neo.
He's going to kill me, but okay. Sorry. Thank you, Neo.
Okay, thank you. That was
great.
Extra
scrambled egg later. So
extra scrambled egg. That's so nice. Okay. Marzipan Pig says.
I know that name.
Yeah, I feel like I've seen it on Twitter. Marzipan Pig says that I called my mom on my lunch breaks to read her stanzas from Dead Astronauts. Poetry. And do you think of it as poetry?
I do. I mean, I was a poet to begin with, and I published like 60 or 70 poems before I just didn't think I was a good enough poet, and I kept being drawn to storytelling in a different way. But at the same time, it was really useful for Dead Astronauts, which is so serious and has so many different character voices, to draw on the kind of like tension and immediacy and the kind of heightened prose that you find in a lot of poetry. And so I definitely channeled that and the rhythm. And it's definitely a book that's meant to be read aloud, which is very different from, say, Annihilation, which, you know, is very interior and insular and not necessarily meant to be read aloud, which is why I told so many anecdotes on book tour for it about being charged by a giant pig, because I didn't want to read too much of it because it's very thick in its way. So, but Dead Astronauts definitely meant to be read aloud.
I think we have time for one more, which is Odelia Rubin asks, how do you deal with global pandemic as a fiction writer, which I think you talked about a little. Do you think that it'll exist maybe somewhere in the murky past in anything you write from here on out?
Well, I feel like it's in the murky past of Dead Astronauts, just not remarked upon. I mean, that's maybe a J.K. Rowling response, but
that's a burn.
But it's definitely, I feel like it's there in the precursor. But I am working on this novel, Hummingbird Salamander, where I have several decisions to make. I can't mention the T word, because as soon as you do, that brings in all these associations that I don't want in the novel, because it's not that kind of novel. And now I have to worry about, how do I bring in the pandemic, the T word, TRU, so on and so forth. But anyway.
Okay. I was like.
Didn't want to say it. I didn't want to conjure it up here either. But
don't say it.
now I just have to finish the novel, which already is in this context of climate crisis collapse, and it's about eco-terrorism and wildlife trafficking, and then just figure out by the time the novel is to be published what layering is required for the pandemic. Does it change the novel entirely? Does it not? Do I, but I feel like that the pandemic can still exist within this novel without me just like chucking the whole thing and writing something called Landscraper about some weird person gardening in my yard, so but basically it definitely is something that gave me writer's block for about a month, and then I finally got back into the novel like about 6 weeks ago, and I'm not having any problems right now. I'm just thinking of it as existing in a parallel Earth, so
Useful.
Yeah.
Well, this has been so much fun. I thank you so much. I can't wait to read that book, or maybe I'll go back and read some of the mushroom bird books that I've heard exist. Like, what are they called?
Yes, yes, the mushroom bird books. That's a good way of describing them. Let's be enigmatic that way. Yeah. So there'll be an announcement about those soon too. So.
Okay, great. I can't wait. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. I really, really appreciate it.
It was really fun.